In a quiet English town, a trusted doctor held the lives of hundreds in his hands. Patients adored him, families relied on him, but behind the reassuring smile was something far darker than anyone could have ever imagined. This is the story of Harold Shipman, the healer who became history's most prolific serial killer. And the question that still haunts us today, how did no one see it coming? Harold Shipman was born on January the 14th, 1946 on the Bestwood estate in Nottingham, the second of three, to father Harold Sr., a lorry driver, and his mother Vera. His parents were both working class and devout Methodists, but Harold was always extremely close to his mother. Unfortunately, she passed away from cancer on June the 21st, 1963, when her son was only 17. It was believed that it was this experience that later led to Shipman's MO. During his mother's later stages of cancer, she was given morphine by the doctor, and he witnessed her pain subside, intriguing the young man. Growing up, he was an accomplished rugby and cricket player, becoming the vice captain of the athletics team in college, though he was frequently bullied for being a loner and incredibly antisocial. On November the 5th, 1966, Shipman married Primrose May Oxtoby, to which they had 4 children together. Sarah on Valentine's Day in 1967, Christopher on April the 21st, 1970, David on March the 20th, 1979, and Sam on April the 4th, 1982. He went on to study medicine in Leeds, graduating in 1970 before gaining work at the Pontefract General Infirmary in West Yorkshire. He supposedly became addicted to painkillers after watching his mother's death, sometimes illegally prescribing himself the drugs in order to feed his addiction. At one point this was discovered, but he received a warning from the General Medical Council and was then allowed to return to work, with no restrictions being implemented on him prescribing any more drugs.
When you were looking at the way he was using high-cost drugs, how is it possible that you missed the fact that he was stockpiling morphine and diamorphine?
The health authority didn't in fact miss the fact that Dr. Shipman was doing anything. We actually identified the fact that Dr. Shipman has always been a high prescriber.
In 1974, he became a GP at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Centre in Todmorden, but by the following year he was caught forging himself prescriptions of pethidine. He was fined £600 and forced to attend a drug rehab clinic in York, but it was around this time when his rampage began. On August the 21st, 1975, Harold Shipman visited 27-year-old Elaine Oswald and attempted to assist her, injecting a needle into her left arm. She would awaken on the floor at the foot of her bed to find Shipman, his wife, their young son, and 2 paramedics. She spent 4 days in hospital and found Shipman extremely caring during this time, even being invited to supper by his family. He claimed that she was clearly just allergic to an opiate-based painkiller that he had prescribed, and that he had saved her with the kiss of life. Regardless, little did she know at the time that she would be one of the few to survive his wrath. In 1977, he worked briefly as a GP at Donnybrook Medical Centre in Manchester, and throughout the 80s, his work soon spread across Hyde. It was in 1983 when he was interviewed in a Granada television documentary entitled World in Action, in which he detailed how he felt the mentally ill should be treated in society.
In the past, if a patient had got a mental illness that required admission to hospital, the patient was formally admitted, undressed and placed in bed, and was treated as though they had a physical illness. The consultant would come round, often in a white coat, and there was an invisible barrier between the patient and the doctor. Brindle House has gone a long way to breaking these barriers down. If you've got a mental illness such as depression, to have you admitted to a hospital is adding another factor towards that depression. If you can stay in the community, receive your treatment in the community, with your family around you, your usual friends, then this all adds to the speed of recovery from the illness.
We see an eye close. It's like almost a double blink. The eyes don't open, but there's a double blink. And here, 17 frames out of 25, almost 2/3 of a second, where the eyes are in a closed position. When people lie, they distance themselves from the lie, and an eye closure is a signal of that. We also see a single-sided shoulder shrug from his left shoulder. It's tiny, And we can't really see his hands, but at this same point where he's saying it's another factor,
He's adding another factor towards that depression.
I don't think he believes that because we've got the eye closure and the single-sided shoulder shrug.
It was in 1993 when Shipman established his own surgery at 21 Market Street, and he soon became a respected member of the community. But over the next few years, some were beginning to become suspicious. On March the 6th, 1995, Harold visited his 81-year-old patient Marie West, injecting her with a fatal dose of diamorphine, completely unaware that her friend was in the other room. This friend was Marion Hadfield, who left to use the restroom. When she returned, she heard her friend talking to a man, so she waited outside but couldn't hear what was being said. When Shipman came out, he seemed surprised to see that somebody else was there. He then claimed that her friend was dead, but he didn't seem too surprised. Experts have claimed that, quote, a sudden death from natural causes would occur with at least a gasp, if not a collapse to the floor, end quote. Despite this, Hadfield heard absolutely no sound whatsoever. He didn't call for an ambulance, attempt resuscitation, or even request a post-mortem. He initially informed Marie's son that she had died from a stroke, but he then changed this to a heart attack.
What was your experience? Because I understand that Dr. Shipman merely left you a note in the house to say that your mother had had a stroke.
That's right. He actually left a note asking us to actually contact him or get my mum to hospital, as that she wouldn't actually go, which I found at the time appalling, that he'd do that and not actually make her go to hospital or at least contact one of her family.
On May the 29th, 1996, 54-year-old Valerie Cuthbert was found dead in her home. On July the 11th, 67-year-old Irene Turner was found dead, fully clothed on her bed by her neighbour Sheila Ward, not long after Shipman had paid her a visit. Earlier in the day, he had asked this neighbour to help pack some of her belongings for her to go to hospital, but strangely had asked her to wait a few minutes first before doing so. Morphine was later found inside her body. The family found it especially suspicious as she was previously as, quote, bright as a button, end quote. But Shipman was described as being cold and calculating, as he claimed that there was no need for a post-mortem due to the number of tablets that she was on.
I think it's very difficult when you look at the situation now. You've got to really see how he grew into this whole activity. Perhaps in the early stages, perhaps some of his early victims, he just gave them an overdose without intending to kill them. He then saw the consequences of this, felt he could get away with it, and then began to think more and more about that as a way of dealing with various situations. He clearly, in that community, he was regarded as a very significant individual and felt his judgments were right, and perhaps there was something more he could get out of it. As that unfolded, he then perhaps began to think he could possibly make some money out of it and begin to think of himself as doing that in a much more focused way.
On February the 28th, 1997, 77-year-old Lizzie Adams followed, dying in her home. Shipman claimed that she had died from pneumonia and that he had tried to call for an ambulance, but no such call was ever found to have actually been made. On April the 25th, 58-year-old Jean Lilly was next, but a neighbour grew concerned with just how long Shipman had been visiting her, considering that she was only suffering from a minor cold. Just moments after Harold left the property, the neighbour discovered her dead body. A post-mortem concluded that she had died from a lethal dose of morphine, and by the time she was found, she had been dead for quite some time. On May the 29th, 1997, Shipman injected morphine into 63-year-old Ivy Lomas, killing her on Market Street. He then proceeded to visit 3 more patients and informed his own receptionist that he had failed to resuscitate her. Allegedly, Lomas was a frequent visitor of his surgery, so much so that Shipman described her as a nuisance, often joking that the seating area should be reserved just for her and that she should have her own plaque put up.
I don't remember him getting particularly drunk. I don't remember him getting into any trouble. He was very middle of the road, controlled, sensible. Didn't push the boundaries. Didn't appear to try to push the boundaries. Somebody who you would think in the future would be a good, respectable, responsible doctor.
It would only continue on July the 14th, 1997, when Shipman paid a visit to 76-year-old Muriel Grimshaw, who was later found dead. Harold managed to convince authorities that there was no need for a post-mortem, and morphine was later found inside her system as well. On November the 24th, 67-year-old Marie Quinn was next, as she supposedly contacted Shipman complaining about feeling unwell, until he injected her with morphine to kill her. No records were ever found of her actually making a call to the man. On December the 9th that same year, 81-year-old Kathleen Wagstaff received a visit from Shipman, and he soon confirmed that she had died. He had injected her with morphine but claimed that it was heart disease. But even more tragically, this death was a complete accident. Harold had visited Angela Wagstaff at her work to inform her of her mother's death, but it was actually her mother-in-law. He intended to kill another patient, Anne Royal, whose daughter was married to Kathleen's son Peter. She had previously gifted a bottle of gin to Shipman's office earlier that day. Just one day later, 49-year-old German divorcee Bianca Pomfrey was found dead at her home by her son William, on the same day that she had been visited by Shipman. She had been injected with excessive amounts of morphine. Shipman claimed that she had complained to him about chest pains, and he would end up fabricating false medical records in order to cover his tracks. On January the 26th, 1998, 65-year-old Nora Nuttall paid a visit to Shipman's surgery to seek some cough medicine. Harold, for some reason, decided to pay her a home visit before her son Anthony later found her dead body slumped in a chair. On February the 9th, 1998, 68-year-old Pamela Hillier mysteriously passed away. Shipman told her family that she had died from high blood pressure, but in actuality, he had injected her with a lethal dose of morphine. The frequency would only continue on February the 18th as 57-year-old former college lecturer Maureen Ward, who had previously suffered from cancer but was in generally good health, soon mysteriously passed away. Shipman would claim that it was from a brain tumour, though he informed others that it was from diabetes. Patricia Powell believed that she was able to save her own mother's life, as she refused to leave her alone with Shipman. Her mother was 64-year-old Margaret Beckwith, who had an appointment with him at Market Street, and he asked Patricia to leave the room for the examination, but she refused as she felt like something just wasn't quite right. Another patient was Louisa Alicito, who claimed that he dismissed her. Quote, "I went to him once with a rash on my hand and he sent me away. He said if everybody came to me with a rash on their hand, this surgery would always be full. He was a horrible, evil man to do that to people." End quote. Another patient was Ian Wyatt, who was visited by him as a child and described him as a nasty, horrible and arrogant person who believed that he knew what was wrong with the victims more than the victims themselves. He even admitted that Shipman was the very reason he was terrified to visit the doctor for years. It was in March 1998 when Linda Reynolds, a GP at Brooks Surgery, expressed her concerns to coroner John Pollard. Shipman's patients seemed to have a high death rate, and there also appeared to be a large number of cremation forms for the elderly women, in which he was asked to countersign.
Dr. Shipman was particularly unpleasant about you personally. I mean, at one point in these notes he calls you a publicity-seeking moron. I mean, what did you make of that?
Well, he criticised me, but he also criticised his own leading counsel. He criticised Richard Henriquez, who is now Sir Richard Henriquez, a very respected High Court judge. He criticised the police, he criticised the CPS. So I really think I'm in pretty good company in terms of the criticism, and it really doesn't worry me one jot.
However, on April the 17th, it was concluded that there was just not enough evidence, so this was discarded. This decision was later criticised for assigning inexperienced investigators on the case, and it would lead to Shipman continuing the killings after this incident. On May the 11th, 1998, 73-year-old widow Winifred Mellor, who had been a patient of Shipman's for 18 years, was found dead in her chair at her home with her left sleeve rolled up, suggesting a heroin addiction. She had been killed by a fatal injection, and he then falsified more records to state that she had died from coronary thrombosis. Earlier in the day, Shipman had paid a visit to her neighbour Gloria Ellis, in which she gave him a key to her home. Harold mysteriously asked her to wait a while before checking on her friend, supposedly to allow the morphine to kick in. Quote, "We went into the house and Mrs. Mellor was sat up proper, fully dressed, and she just looked like she'd gone to sleep. I sat outside and cried. I'd never seen anyone dead, and she was a friend. A lovely friend." End quote.
He just breezed past me, totally ignored me. He also never looked at Mrs. Mellor, whose remains were in the chair. She was there dead at the time, and he just immediately went for her daughters and immediately began talking at them rather than talking to them. And his opening statement was, "You do know your mother had a heart condition, don't you?" And she wouldn't accept treatment and she wouldn't go to the hospital. And almost without pausing said, "Have you got an undertaker?"
She was a healthy, active woman with a full life to lead and plans to fulfill. And he wasn't doing her any favours. If people think he's gone round to these, as people think, elderly ladies, and he's doing them a bit of, it's justice what he's doing, it isn't. It's not just Mum, a lot of the other ladies had full, active lives. He is just an evil man.
On June the 12th, a neighbour discovered the body of 73-year-old Joan Melia after being paid a visit from Harold Shipman regarding a chest infection. Her body contained morphine, but Shipman ruled it down to pneumonia and emphysema. This was also another instance of Shipman claiming to have called for an ambulance, but there being no evidence to confirm this. On June the 24th, 1998, former Mayoress of Hyde, Kathleen Grundy, was found dead in her home. Harold Shipman was the last to see her alive and would later sign her death certificate himself, recording the cause as old age.
Sadly, nothing that's happened here, nor can happen in the future, can bring back my mum and all the other victims. We hope we can now have the space and the time to remember my mum as she was, a happy, active, caring, energetic, loving person, whom we miss so much.
What raised suspicion was that these people were in seemingly great health, but then randomly seemed to drop dead all of a sudden. Her daughter, solicitor Angela Woodruff, was incredibly suspicious, as she was informed by another solicitor, Brian Burgess, that Kathleen had supposedly left behind a will which oddly excluded Angela and her children and instead left Harold Shipman £386,000 in inheritance, leading to further investigation.
It wasn't so much the fact that she had left her estate apparently to Dr. Shipman, but it was the will itself. When we saw a copy of that, we realised it wasn't my mother's signature. It wasn't a document to which she would have put her name. It was badly typed. It just wasn't my mother at all.
Her body was exhumed and re-examined to find traces of diamorphine, which is heroin. This was often used for pain control in patients with terminal cancer, but when questioned, Shipman claimed that Grundy was just an addict, providing notes that he had written in his computerized medical journal to prove this. However, it was later concluded that these were written after her death. In August that same year, taxi driver John Shaw contacted the police, convinced that Shipman was responsible for murdering 21 different patients. Shaw had taken many elderly people to the hospital who appeared to be in perfectly good health before they all strangely died under his care. Despite the suspicion, he was still largely respected and considered by most to be a good doctor.
This man came to be in the club, and he was a lovely guy. And he was very charismatic, and he eventually he became the chairman of the club.
Right.
And I was his secretary, or I was the club secretary, should I say. But we worked very closely together. And the night before it all blew up, we had a meeting before the election of the committee members, and he said to me, I said, "Oh, are you running for office next year, Fred?" And he said, "I'm in a spot of bother." And I said, "Oh, really?" And with him being a doctor, I thought, and he was a really nice guy, and I thought, well...
Marjorie, who was it? Who was it? Is it anyone we know?
Dr. Shipman. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I know, that's because I'm not saying anything for once in the show. So you were on a committee with Dr. Harold Shipman?
Yes, he was the chairman, and I was the secretary of the committee.
Right, Marjorie, so
he said to me, you know, I'm in the spot of bother.
Yeah.
So I said, well, I thought, well, maybe a lady patient has made an accusation against him. You know, quickly in your mind.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, you know, I was a bit shocked, really, to think that a lady patient could do that, because he was a really nice guy.
How shocked were you when his face started appearing in newspapers
Well,
accused
the night after, my son shouted up, "Mum, Mum, 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 Fred's on the telly." And I thought, "Fred?" I said, "What? Do you mean Fred de Doings or Fred de Doings?" And he said, "Dr. Shipman, Mum, Dr. Shipman." And I run downstairs, and it was all over the news.
So, Marjorie, I got to know, we're talking about sort of respectability. You just felt you were totally taken in by him?
Absolutely. When I heard the news, and the phone obviously never stopped ringing, and we couldn't believe it. Every one of the committee members just could not believe it. We thought there'd been a great big mistake.
Has it changed? Has it changed how...
Oh, yeah.
It really has changed how you view everybody.
I don't love the children anymore.
You don't?
Because he could... I know what he did was unbelievable. But if he'd have been a paedophile, I wouldn't have known.
Paul Spencer claimed, quote, "I genuinely thought he was a great doctor, very intelligent. I went to see him with different things and he always had time to talk. You would expect to be kept waiting, but you accepted it because you knew he would spend time with you. There was a year-long wait to get onto his list. He was the most popular doctor in Hyde," end quote. On September the 7th, 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested and he was found owning a Brother typewriter, the exact same type that had been used to make the forged will of Kathleen Grundy. It was believed that he had orchestrated the will because he had lost control of his life and he wanted to be caught, or that he wanted to flee the country and retire somewhere quietly.
The word I've used on a number of occasions when I've been asked about this is that he was incredibly arrogant, and I think these letters show further arrogance in the sense of blaming everybody else, accepting no blame himself.
I've given you the cause of death, fatal overdose of morphine or diamorphine. They've asked you to comment about that.
And I have commented. I've said that I have my suspicions that she was actually abusing a narcotic of some sort. I'm not suggesting she took drugs every day. Far from it. But the scenario was there, and she did have drugs available. She may well have given herself accidentally an overdose.
He came across an interview as being somebody who wanted to control the situation. He saw it very much as a competition. It was him against the police. He wanted to dominate the interview. He was highly confident that he would be able to explain away these anomalies that we were going to put to him.
It's an extension, isn't it, of what we learnt previously about him, and I don't really see that it alters the opinion that people held before, so it merely reinforces that which we all knew about. An example being, if you remember when he was being interviewed, he objected to being interviewed by detective constables. He wanted to be interviewed by very senior detective officers. Well, again, it's the same sort of thing. They weren't seeking glory in those days. They were doing their job. When I held inquests into some of his victims, it wasn't a question of my seeking glory. I am legally obliged to hold those inquests, and that's what I did. And it shows how completely and utterly misguided he was about a lot of things, I'm afraid.
Stand and let you take a photograph, and then go away. And I'm sure you've had enough time to take a decent photograph.
He was convinced that his computer would have erased a history of him falsifying medical records, but even once deleted, the documents were still traceable. Shipman attempted to claim that most of the victims were drug addicts, which is why the morphine was in their system to begin with, but this wasn't believed. Investigators had to look into hundreds of deaths that took place under his care, noticing a pattern of him administering lethal doses of morphine as well as signing their death certificates and falsifying their medical records to suggest that they were already in poor health. The deaths almost always took place around the exact same time of day, during his afternoon visits, and he was always around when they took their final breath.
It may be that my office dealt with the death of some of his patients, but if, for instance, they died at a hospital or died in road traffic accidents, I wouldn't necessarily know who the GP was anyway in that situation.
The trial began on October the 5th, 1999 in Preston Crown Court, and he was charged with the murders of 15 women between 1995 and 1998. Shipman's legal team attempted to have him tried for Grundy's murder separately, based on the fact that the forged will meant there was a motive, but this was denied. On January the 31st, 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, Harold Shipman was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery, leading to a sentence of life imprisonment.
The result is the right result. It was the only result that could possibly have been. My mother trusted Dr. Shipman. He cynically and callously betrayed that trust.
On February the 11th, a month later, he was officially struck off the medical register, but Shipman has always denied his guilt. He's never done any interviews or spoke publicly, but despite all of the evidence against him, he maintained his innocence, as did his wife Primrose, despite working as a receptionist at his medical practice during his rampage. His children often visited him in prison, while his son Christopher entered legal issues as private confidential emails he had exchanged with his father were traced without his consent, but nothing of note was found or released. Shipman was the first doctor in the history of British medicine who was actually found guilty of murder. All other previously were acquitted, but due to this case, it led to an examination of the British legal system for having allowed this to happen in the first place. In 2003, statistician David Spiegelhalter pointed out that Shipman's mortality rates were fairly normal between 1988 and 1994, but they began to increase the following year. By the end of 1996, there were 67 excess deaths of his female patients over the age of 65. And by the end of 1998, this had risen again to 119, but sadly, justice would not be met. On January the 13th, 2004, just days before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman committed suicide, hanging himself at His Majesty Prison Wakefield without ever facing the true punishment of his crimes. Naturally, the families of his victims felt cheated, as they never received a confession or any answers, while Home Secretary David Blunkett admitted that a celebration was rather tempting. Quote, "You wake up and you receive a call telling you that Shipman had topped himself, and you think, is it too early to open a bottle? And then you discover that everybody's very upset that he's done it." End quote. Peter Connell, the nephew of Victor Merle Grimshaw, stated, quote, "The state should have given him a lethal injection. He shouldn't have been allowed to kill himself. He was a mass murderer." End quote. Shipman was branded a coward, but a lot of criticism was put onto the prison service for even making this possible to begin with. It was even considered a possibility to replace life sentencing with an indefinite sentence instead. This means that the inmate would be given hope of eventually being released one day, and therefore they wouldn't feel hopeless enough to take their own life. A definitive motive for the suicide has never been confirmed. He supposedly told a probation officer that he was considering it to assure his wife's financial security after he'd been removed from the NHS register. Primrose was granted a full NHS pension, which he wouldn't have been entitled to if he had lived past the age of 60. Towards the end of his life, he refused to take part in any courses which would have involved acknowledging his crimes, but due to this, he lost privileges, including telephone calls to his wife. It was also believed that Primrose herself was beginning to suspect his guilt after all. Shipman supposedly received a letter from her at one point saying, quote, "Tell me everything, no matter what." End quote. But it was determined that his suicide couldn't have been predicted or prevented, though many doubt this claim. The police advised his wife to not have him buried in fear of people vandalising the graves. He was instead cremated at Hutcliffe Wood Crematorium, which was only attended by his widow and their 4 children. Determining the exact number of murders is practically impossible. Detective Chris Gregg believed that he killed at least 218, and the judge Janet Smith was convinced that one was even a 4-year-old girl. He was assigned to look after the 4-year-old Susie Garfitt, who was suffering from pneumonia caused by cerebral palsy and quadriplegia. Shipman convinced her father to sit down and have a cup of tea while he looked after her, but after just 10 minutes, he informed him that his child was dead. Between 1971 and 1998, 459 people died, so Smith is convinced that the exact number is around 250. 6 additional doctors were charged for signing the cremation forms for Shipman's victims due to their misconduct and not noticing the pattern between his home visits and their deaths, but they were all found not guilty. It was also a possibility that he may have stolen jewellery from the victims, as officers discovered over £10,000 worth inside his garage. 33 pieces did not belong to his wife, and they were eventually auctioned off, with the funds being sent to Tameside Victim Support. This case is what led to massive changes being made to standard medical procedures in the UK, being known as the Shipman effect. Changes were made to dispensing practices and the reluctance to risk over-prescribing pain medication to patients. There were also changes to death certificate practices, with single doctor practices being altered to multiple, and investigations went into safeguarding and the monitoring of doctors' decisions, which led to other murderous doctors years later thankfully being caught a lot quicker had it not been for this case.
We hope that they will consider the procedure on certification of death and whether it should always involve a second doctor who's inspected the medical records, whether doctors should be allowed to be sole practitioners, and the way dangerous drugs are prescribed, held and disposed of by doctors.
His motive has always been speculated. Some believe that he was trying to avenge the death of his mother, while others are convinced he was practicing euthanasia by removing the population of the elderly who may have become a burden to the national healthcare system. A more sinister possibility is that Harold Shipman actually enjoyed being a doctor, but gained pleasure from having the power of life or death over his victims. The final will was the only time he found any financial gain. Harold Shipman shattered the most sacred bond between doctor and patient, trust. His crimes left hundreds of families without answers and a community forever scarred. Though he's gone, the questions remain. How could one man murder on such a scale, hidden in plain sight? And more importantly, how do we make sure it never happens again? The story of Harold Shipman is more than a tale of a killer. It's a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a trusted face, leaving everyone around it seeking answers.